So tonight we'll be hearing from panelists on the heightened state of nuclear risks, the refugee crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and strategies for moving forward, including action steps. Each presentation will be 10 to 15 minutes long, and the Q&A will be after all the panelists have spoken. Mariana's the timekeeper for the panelists, and she'll let them know via chat when there's a minute or two before the end. This forum is dedicated to the war resistors, those who want an end to this bloodshed of wars everywhere. So we keep them in our hearts and our spirits and are inspired and challenged by them. So our first speaker tonight focuses on the refugee crisis. Aly Wane is an undocumented human rights activist originally from Senegal. He's a member of the Peace Council Steering Committee and is a policy consultant with the UndocuBlack Network. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Aly. The Zoom is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me with this. You know, when you mentioned that we're giving presentations, I was just like, whoa, I'm just offering you some thoughts here. It's not that formal, but I really appreciate to be here in this space to share some thoughts with Dawn, with Khury, who I'm a big fan of. I think that we met at the Socialism conference. I really appreciate all the work that you do. Listened to the amazing panel discussion that you had yesterday. I thought was really, really useful. And I first want to say, you know, so I'm going to talk about this from my perspective as an undocumented activist who's been thinking about migration, refugee flows for a long time. And so what I'd like to do is talk about the refugee crisis in Ukraine, but also sort of contextualize it in terms of what's happening with migration flows and how we should, what kind of analysis we should have in terms of thinking about all of these issues. And the first thing that I wanted to say was that I'm really grateful that we start these conversations with land acknowledgements. You know, I'm one of those migrants' rights activists who's absolutely a believer in borders are absurd. We live, you know, in one globe, whether we like it or not. The coming couple of decades, we're going to have to reckon with the fact that we have one planet that we're all going to have to share. And all of these sort of reactionary erections of border walls and constructions and everything, eventually we're going to have to reconcile some of these contradictions and allow people to freely travel across borders in the same way that we've been allowing multinational corporations for the past couple of years through so-called free trade agreements to cross borders from country to country in order to seek more and more exploitable labor. So that's just to frame the convo, but I did want to start with just some numbers to just give us a sense of what we're looking at. So according to the latest United Nations figures, 11 million people have been displaced by this conflict. And I do want to take a moment to really let that sink in. I mean, think about in your own life what it would take, you know, what it would mean for you to have to be displaced and to have to find a home, you know, within a couple of hours. That's what's happening to 11 million people in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. And out of those 11 million, about 5.3 million have had to cross borders. And they've crossed borders to lots of different countries. I believe that the country that has received the most refugees has been Poland due to its proximity, followed by a bunch of EU countries, and Russia has actually taken in quite a few refugees as well for its own political reasons. Here, it's not just about hospitality, right? And first I want to start with the good news, which is that from my perspective, it seems like the world has mostly positively responded to making sure that those refugees are taken care of. From last I checked, the European Union has offered refugees the right to stay and work for at least 3 years with access to social welfare and access to housing medical treatment, and schools. And we have seen definitely, story after story of people opening their homes to Ukrainian refugees, to paying for people's hotel stays, enormous amounts of generosity in a way that I think we can't underestimate that. That is a really beautiful piece of this story, and we should not forget that. That being said, there have been lots of issues at the border. Obviously, at a lot of these different borders, Ukrainian nationals have been the ones who have been prioritized in terms of allowing them to cross borders. And I do want to talk about the issue of race here. Some of you might be aware of the fact that there was a crisis of Black migrants, mostly African migrants, in Ukraine, who were having lots of issues fleeing the carnage that was happening in Ukraine. Many stories of Black migrants being refused, boarding trains to go to the border, or once they get to the border, being told, you have to go back. We're prioritizing nationals. And there have been even cases of people who've been refused hotel stays. And so I just want to put a pin on that, on the fact that in the midst of this incredible misery, we're still dealing with sort of global anti-Blackness, and unfortunately, Black migrants have been treated in I think, lesser ways. Thankfully, there have been a lot of mutual aid efforts, a lot of GoFundMes out there, done mostly by Black organizers outside of the Ukraine. A lot of support has come from British Black activists who've really supported these Black migrants in terms of getting them resources, and also to get them support to be able to eventually leave the conflict zone. And I want to sort of use this issue to transition into the context that I want to give around this crisis, which is, Khury was on a panel yesterday, and Phyllis Bennis was also on the panel with him, another person I really appreciate. And one of the comments that she made, which I thought was really powerful, and it occurred to me as an anti-war activist, how did I miss this? One of the things that she said was striking about this particular war is the amount of sympathetic coverage that civilians have gotten in terms of this war, the sort of like nonstop, what's happening to Ukrainian citizens. And now, obviously, that is a good thing, right? That's something that we would want in any war conflict. We want to make sure that we prioritize the health and welfare of the folks who are targeted by this war effort. But it also poses the question, why? Why so much sympathy for these migrants, as opposed to all of the other wars we could talk about? We could talk about the Israel-Palestine issue and Palestinian refugees. We could talk about Yemen. We could talk about all of these conflicts where we just don't hear about these refugees. And as I was doing some research for this, I found this quote from an expert at York University. He's a kind of a centrist expert who's consulted with the UN. His name is Michael Baruchitsky, I believe is his name. And one of the things that he said that I thought was really helpful in terms of thinking about these situations. He said, Ukrainians receive preferential treatment because they are Western allies in the geopolitical struggle against Russia and benefit from geographic and cultural proximity. And I thought that that was really helpful to think about. Because if we want to talk about why some refugees, some folks who flee war get more attention and more sympathy, we have to talk about power politics, and we have to talk about geopolitics. It is not out of the US's largesse, or its inherent kindness and hospitality that all of a sudden it's a bleeding heart country that just wants to welcome all of these refugees. That's simply not the case. The US has an interest in weakening Russia. Now, there are deeper conversations around, Putin, sort of what he wants to do and all of that. But the point is whether you're talking about Putin or whether you're talking about the US, we need to think about what are the interests of these states and why they want to harness our sympathy for certain refugees as opposed to other refugees. And to sort of bring it back to the US context, as Carol mentioned, one of my positions right now is as a policy consultant with the UndocuBlack Network. We are a group of some undocumented and some formerly undocumented folks who have been working on immigration policy for a long time. We tend to have a pretty abolitionist view of borders and immigration. And one of the things that's been striking to us, and I think to anyone who's been working on refugee issues for all of these years, has been like, whoa, like we've been trying to get this administration to have sympathy for migrants coming from Central and South America and from African countries, from Asian countries, for all of those years with little success. And we're not just talking about Trump, we're talking about the Biden administration as well, and the Obama administration before. But all of a sudden this war starts and there's this like huge sympathy, rightfully so, for Ukrainian migrants. And like within a day or two, the Biden administration made an exception for them when it came to this policy that a lot of us had been trying to repeal for quite a bit, called the Title 42 policy. Now, the Title 42 policy is a policy that was invoked by the Trump administration basically as a way to shut down asylum claims at the border. The idea is that in the midst of a dangerous pandemic, we need to be closing off our borders in order to keep our country safe. Lots of both human rights experts and folks, even folks from inside the CDC, have said that this closing off of the borders does absolutely nothing to help with stopping the pandemic. In fact, the information that came out has been that in fact, if you look at what's happening at the border, because of all the bottlenecking that's been happening and the short-term incarcerating of immigrants, that's acted as a force multiplier for the pandemic. So we're actually doing the opposite of this. And so, for quite a while, since the Trump administration, we've been making the arguments as human rights organizers, like, let's repeal Title 42 in order for people's rights to asylum, to be respected. And at first, the Biden administration said that they were going to make an exception to the rule around Title 42 for Ukrainian immigrants. And it just happened so quickly. But then the hypocrisy of that exception, I think, played a factor in the Biden administration finally, coming to the decision to try and repeal Title 42 as a whole. This has been after years of arguments that Title 42 was absurd and really hurt migrants at the border. And so obviously there's the racial contrast, right? Like we can make the easy kind of like, okay, white European migrants are under assault and need refuge, and we give them preferential treatment, as opposed to Black and brown folks, who we need to push out. I am sure many of you remember just the horrendous images at the border of Haitian migrants even being whipped, under the Biden administration. And to this day, they have done nothing to redress what happened. So first of all, there's that contrast, the obvious racial analysis contrast of like, well, are we making an exception for these migrants? And if you heard some of the rhetoric that came out of many media outlets, it was cringe, right? Like there were a bunch of media operatives who are saying things like, well, these migrants, it's not like it's out there in Africa or in Asia, they're these blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who watch Netflix. Somehow Netflix got into the argument. I don't know how we got there. So there was already that racial contradiction, but I think the deeper power contradiction is really much more about policy. And obviously, and I'm going to have to wrap up real quick. Obviously, the reason that we hear about these Ukrainian migrants is that we want to give hospitality to these migrants is because they play a role in the power politics of the US, especially when it comes to its opposition to Russia, which is a power player. Now, I'm not here to debate the sort of the good and evil of Russia and everything. We can get into some really complicated conversations, especially among leftists, even as I would say that broadly among the left, we agree that clearly, Russia is the aggressor in this particular case, and that we need to make sure that these refugees are taken care of. So I'm actually coming to the end of my time. I should have maybe formalized my talk a little bit more. I do want to have some time to give some time for Don and Khury to add some thoughts to this. I might not be here for the entire presentation, but I will make myself available for the Q&A. So probably turn off my camera for a little bit, but I will definitely be there for the Q&A and looking forward to the rest of the convo. So thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Aly. We really appreciate your work and the effort that you put into all of this. So thank you. And thank you especially for reminding us that there's many layers to this issue, and that there's sort of the obvious layers, which were not so obvious to many people in the beginning, but became obvious, and then layers upon layers after that. So thank you for that. Our next presentation is on the risk of nuclear war. Dr. Don Hughes is a member of the Peace Council's Nuclear Free World Committee and has advocated for the elimination of nuclear weapons for over 20 years. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Don, and please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Aly. That was just terrific presentation. So I am going to put on my professorial hat here and switch to a PowerPoint, if I can figure out how to get there. Share screen. Okay, there we go. And so what I want to do is, nuclear weapons, everyone's least favorite subject, the whole point of my presentation is to talk about what role they play in this whole unfortunate situation with the invasion of Ukraine. So I want to provide some historical backdrop, because that really, I think, helps to understand how we got to where we are, and then some suggestions for how to move ahead. So I'll show you this graphic, and let me get to a full screen, so that would give us a little more screen space here. So this is a crazy graphic, but it's put together by the atomic scientists group. And I'm going to break this down. What they've done is they're showing a timeline in a big arc here, starting with 1940, going around, and the graphic is showing countries gaining nuclear weapons, size of stockpile. That's these lines, this graphic up here. Pointing in is the number of tests that have been conducted. The brown is US. The darker red is Russia. That was then USSR. What I've done is to kind of blow this up so we can get zoom in and look at it more closely. So, of course, the nuclear age began when the Manhattan Project was launched in 1942, and subsequently we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, in 1945. Bulletin of Atomic Scientists created the Doomsday Clock two years later and have been updating it ever since. So I've circled the countries that have joined, have acquired nuclear weapons. So it was about 1950 that Russia got their first nukes. And France joined the club around 1960. Then we had China, then we had Israel, India into the 70s, and South Africa. Remember South Africa? They're a country that gained nuclear weapons and then they agreed to get rid of them. So that's a possible thing. The size, the stockpile of the warheads is given in this, these overlapping lines here. So this line is, I think, 10,000 warheads. And lots of testing, lots of horrific testing that inflicted just untold damage on human lives and on the environment. Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the whole development of nuclear weapons, and that's one of the closest points we've come to an actual nuclear war. They also have some accidents thrown in here. There was a crash in Spain where hydrogen bombs were, dropped. Fortunately, they didn't go off. So the next 40 years shows up over here, and the stockpile of weapons continues to grow. I'm sorry, I misspoke. This line here is 20,000 warheads, 40,000. So it peaked back in late 80s, right around the time of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And then things started to decline. So there were some positive trends, treaties to limit the tests. So the tests got phased out. And then stockpiles of weapons have declined quite dramatically since the late 80s. And now we're down here, but we still have thousands of warheads. And during this time span, Pakistan acquired nuclear warheads. And I'll talk more about this. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine became nuclear weapon states temporarily due to the breakup of the Soviet Union. And then we have our friends in North Korea. So just a reminder of nuclear weapons tests have just exacted a horrific toll. The favorite training grounds for the US was out in the Pacific Ocean, although they did lots of underground tests in Nevada. Islanders were terribly affected by that, as was a Japanese fishing boat. The Russians dropped lots of bombs in Siberia. This is a panel from a series of panels put out by the an anti-nuclear group in Japan. And so they also victims. So this was the situation pre-1991. We had the so-called Iron Curtain. We had 12 NATO countries in blue, and we had the Warsaw Pact countries. They, of course, were dominated by the USSR, NATO countries dominated by the United States. And that's the way things sat for since the 50s. And you see that some countries have chosen to remain neutral in all of this. This is a reminder of what the USSR used to be. All these countries which have since become independent. And apparently Mr. Putin wants to recreate the old USSR. And his ambition to do so is reflected here. Invasions of Chechnya, starting in the early, right after the dissolution of the USSR. Much later on, invaded 2008, a similar thing to what has happened with Ukraine, except Ukraine has fought back much more vigorously. So, little note here about Russia's aggressions prompted countries to want to join NATO, versus kind of two interpretations here, versus NATO causing Russia to feel threatened. And there's aspects of truth to both of those statements. This is what NATO looks like now. So we had this initial period here up through the 50s with the original Western countries on one side of the Iron Curtain, and then Germany got brought in. And then since then, what were the Soviet bloc countries have joined. And this has isolated Russia. Now, there's some question about the expansion of, was there a pledge made to not expand NATO? And it's kind of a mixed message about this. So there's some evidence that James Baker, when he was the Secretary of State, did make assurances, verbal assurances to Russia that NATO would not expand an inch further to the east. But then there was actually no formal agreement made to that effect. So it's an exaggeration to say that there really was a commitment made not to expand to the east. And I want to make this very clear that what NATO is all about is a military purpose. And I've put up here the commitment that the principle behind NATO, that an attack against one of its members considered an attack against all. So all of the countries in NATO live under a so-called nuclear umbrella. And so used to be, this was a nuclear umbrella over here with Warsaw, and this was a nuclear umbrella with NATO. Now we've got a nuclear umbrella has expanded. And everything about this conflict has a backdrop, a powerful backdrop of nuclear weapons above it. Here's just a look at the lay of the land of who's got nukes and who is hosting nukes or endorsing nukes. So as that earlier graphic indicated, US, what used to be the USSR is now Russia, France, UK, tiny blip here, Israel, India and Pakistan, and of course China, and most recently North Korea. And here are the numbers. So about 13,000 warheads across the world. vast majority held by Russia and the United States. But big numbers here, plenty of weaponry, plenty of firepower to completely annihilate everything on the planet. And notice that NATO countries here hosting nuclear weapons. We've got over 150 of them. And who stands to benefit from these things? Well, the military industrial complex, they do. The rest of us, if one of these things ever goes off, are the losers. And Biden, when he was campaigning, did make a comment that he considered nuclear weapons were, that was a war with nuclear weapons was not winnable and they should never be used. Back in January of 2021, this treaty, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, went into force. So you can see all these countries have voted in favor of adopting it, and the green ones have actually signed or ratified it. And that's this treaty, it commits the signers to not aid, not to host, not to have, not to aid nuclear weapons whatsoever. And the hope here is that some real pressure can be applied by the non-nuclear nations onto the nuclear, put that pressure on the nuclear weapons holding nations to get rid of these things. Now, back to the Ukraine. So back in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, there were lots of nuclear warheads in the Ukraine and a couple other countries, other territories, Belarus, for example, and they agreed to get rid of them. So they removed all this stuff from their territory. So the timeline looks like this. Here's the three countries. They all signed on to this thing called the Lisbon Protocol, and they agreed to give up those weapons. And it took quite a while to get rid of them, but by 2001, they'd all been transferred to Russia and to be dismantled. So that's why Ukraine is a non-nuclear country. Another bit of history here is that there was this thing called the Budapest Memorandum, which specifically talked about respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and to not use force against its territorial integrity. So obviously, Russia has violated this. But a scary aspect of this, which I didn't realize until I reread this today, was this about policy not using nuclear weapons against non-nuclear armed states unless that state attacked them in partnership with a nuclear armed state. Well, Ukraine apparently has attacked Russia in partnership with the United States. So that is a scary proposition right there. This is a picture of Hiroshima. Just a reminder of how horrific these things are. And of course, the weapons that are in the stockpiles now, and not just the stockpiles, but ready to be launched, are in most cases much more powerful. So what can we do about nuclear weapons? Well, let's realize how much money they suck out of the economy, about $75 billion a year. And this is money that certainly could be better spent on other things. I hear there's this thing called climate change. Anybody hear about that? Might be a good idea to address that. So let me just mention that the Syracuse Peace Council, through the Nuclear Free World Committee, has been signing on other organizations with this thing called the Back from the Brink Campaign. And the Back from the Brink Campaign has been organized through the Physicians for Social Responsibility. And there's a number of principles to it. One of the major one is to join TPNW and ultimately get rid of nuclear weapons. But there's some simpler, easier steps, like taking nuclear weapons off of hair trigger alert and getting rid of the president's authority to just launch nuclear weapons without authorization from anybody else.
And Don, if you could start wrapping up, that would be terrific.
Okay, sure. So we have lots of nukes. This is a graphic about Back from the Brink. Let me see if there's anything else I just wanted to mention. The Ukraine conflict has gotten people to think about nuclear weapons. Some small measure of benefit is that. But we've just got to consider that these nuclear weapons are just make everything more dangerous. These conflicts are just much more dangerous. And I will end there.
Thanks, Don. And thanks for that very thorough presentation on the state of the history of the development of nukes here and how they affect the geopolitical system and the impacts they have, even if they aren't technically being dropped. The impacts are great. So thank you so much for all of that information. We next welcome Khury Petersen-Smith, who is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he researches militarism and borders, US empire, and movements that challenge it. Thanks so much. We're really looking forward to having you. He's the out of town visitor, and we're really appreciative for you taking the time to share with us. Thanks. It's yours.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm an out of town person as somebody who currently resides in Boston, but I will say I'm especially honored to join you, not only to join this really awesome panel with Don and Aly, but also because I'm from upstate New York, because I grew up in Albany and went to college in Rochester, and there's a special place in my heart actually for the Syracuse Peace Council, with whom I've gone on marches with and got your calendar. This is the Syracuse Cultural Worker. Anyway, I love Syracuse. I've been stuck in the snow on I-90 in Syracuse, and you reside in my homelands. So I'm really grateful and honored to be here and join you. And I should say, as going after these incredibly thorough and clear presentations, I have the easy job, really. I'll say a word about both what I'm concerned for and about some opportunities. And I'm concerned both about the immediate suffering as well as, unfortunately, there are some plans for suffering in the future. It has to be said, first and foremost, of course, that this invasion and this war is absolutely horrendous. Full stop. There's no justification for it whatsoever. It should be condemned. And I think that many of us in the peace community, and anti-war activists have struggled with what it means to grapple with the reality of an aggressor that is not the United States, because the U.S. is very good at dominating, aggression in the world. But the fact is, it's not the only aggressor in the world, and I think that unfortunately Russia is making it very clear to us, actually, just how violent its militarism is. If that wasn't already evident because of what Russia has done in Syria, what Russia has done in Chechnya and Georgia and elsewhere. So that's the first thing. It's an absolute catastrophe for the people of Ukraine, and they absolutely deserve our solidarity. And there's an immediate just devastation that unfortunately continues. And I'm sorry to say that if we're familiar with what Russia did do in Syria and what it did in Chechnya, we know that unfortunately there's great depth to Russian violence. And so the hope is that this can end as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, however, there's another problem, which is that this crisis, this invasion, is being used to justify, I would argue, a new round of militarism all around the world, and particularly led by the United States. And it's worth saying a word about that, about this moment in US militarism, because actually it should be the opposite. Last year was the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Afghanistan, and the end of its 2 decades long occupation. Next year is the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. These invasions, among the various, almost countless military operations that the US has carried out in Yemen, in Somalia, in Syria, in Libya, and in plenty of other places too. These operations under the heading of the War on Terror have been catastrophic for humanity. And they've also been utter failures by any measure, even in terms of kind of the US's own measures of success. They've been disastrous. And I think that we can look to Afghanistan, where after 20 years of incredible violence driven by the United States, the Taliban won. So even on a military basis, these have been disastrous. And for all of these reasons, first and foremost, the human toll of the War on Terror, this is precisely the time to be talking about demilitarization, to be critically evaluating 2 decades of wars and occupations and other military operations, to be cutting the military budget, to be pulling troops back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what should be happening. And there has been a desire in Washington to avoid that kind of discussion, and on the contrary, to prepare for the next round of wars. That has been a sort of long-term set of goals. And with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they now have a pretext to justify a bigger military budget, and a whole host of other things that I want to talk about. So that's really, it's really a problem. And I think that, Aly talked about the, in many ways, kind of unprecedented coverage, media conversation about the invasion of Ukraine. And that is, I think it's the impact of that is of a mixed character. It's complicated. I think first and foremost, there is something really important and powerful about the fact that many people in this country are for the first time are seeing the reality of war and displacement and things like that. That's something incredibly important, really powerful. And no doubt there's any number of things happening in the day-to-day in Ukraine that are very important, but we should not let the immediacy of the events unfolding in Ukraine prevent us from looking at the long-term plans and designs being set in motion. Because certainly in Washington and in the Pentagon, in Congress and the White House, they're thinking in the long term and not in a good way. Let me be a little more specific when I talk about militarism and how I am afraid there's any number of aspects of US militarism that are getting a new lease on life in the context of this Ukraine crisis. So for example, the question of US sanctions, which the US has sanctions, against many countries, but in particular, catastrophic sanctions against Iran, decades-long sanctions regime against Cuba, sanctions on Venezuela, on North Korea, and other countries. These have been devastating. And there has been a certain questioning of the US sanctions regime, particularly against Iran. In light, however, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent US-led sanctions, they're quite international, but US-led, I'm concerned that the whole notion that sanctions are a legitimate weapon and actually somehow constitute an alternative to war, which I disagree with. I think it's another form of warfare. I'm concerned that sanctions now have a new legitimacy. And this is a problem for two reasons. One is because the sanctions against Russia are quite devastating to Russian people who have nothing to do with this invasion. It's not easy to get a full sense of the impact of the sanctions, given I think what are obvious to us restrictions on Russian media and so on. But we know, for example, that the city government of Moscow has announced that at least 58,000 residents of Moscow have lost their jobs because of the sanctions regime and the resulting impact on the Russian economy that is produced. And that same city government has said that some 200,000 residents of just that city are in danger of losing their jobs because of the level of unraveling that the Russian economy is experiencing right now in light of these sanctions. So that's the first problem. These sanctions in Russia are doing what sanctions always do, which is impact the most vulnerable people, poor people, people with disabilities, sick people, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing is that the sanctions machine that is being deployed in a popular way against Russia, right? Like that's popular in the US, it will not just stay in Russia. They will use this, they will use the legitimacy that the sanctions garner to then deploy them against countries like Iran and Venezuela and others. So that's a disaster. That's sanctions. Another thing is weapons sales, which, the US is, of course, the #1 seller of weapons in the world. That is something that is usually not very public. The US isn't usually open about all the weapons it's selling. At the moment, it's incredibly open. They are celebrating the sale of these weapons. They're naming them, Javelin missiles and so on. And so that people in the US learn the names of these weapons that are made by these American corporations. And again, the legitimacy that comes with openly selling weapons to Ukraine, that will be used to sell weapons elsewhere. This notion that US weapons sales are a good thing, that they defend democracy, is an absolute disaster, and it is inspiring a new round of militarization. And the last thing, and this there's not as much conversation about this as there should be, but the question of US troop deployments themselves. I mean, I think much has been made of the fact that the US may be imposing sanctions on Russia, it may be selling weapons to Ukraine, but the US is not actually deploying troops to Ukraine. That is good and important because that would wildly escalate this conflict. And so on one hand, it's extremely important that the US keep troops out of Ukraine. On the other hand, the US is deploying more troops to Europe. And actually, there is a baseline of 65,000 US troops that are stationed in Europe. In the lead up to the Russian invasion in January, the US had increased that number to 80,000 troops deployed to Europe. And at the moment, it is 100,000 troops, the highest numbers of US troops since 2005, which is around, shortly after the US invasion of Iraq, and that kind of moment in the war on terror. And so there is a new round of militarization that is happening. And it must be said, it's not just in the United States. The United States is actually leading a round of militarization around the world. And so Germany, which has historically been much quieter in its military activity since World War II, the kind of obvious taboo that came with German militarism in that war. In light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany said that it's going to increase its military budget to 2% of its GDP, the largest since World War II, and that Germany would sell weapons to Ukraine as well. Denmark made a similar announcement about raising its military budget, and really throughout Europe, there is a conversation, and not just conversation, but legislation around increasing military budgets and militarization. Japan, which also has had a taboo around militarization since World War II, which has had the people in power in Japan have had a long-term plan to kind of rehabilitate Japanese militarism. They are taking the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a pretext to do more of that. And in fact, just recently, US and Japanese military personnel had the first airborne kind of military training that they've ever had. So there's this whole round of militarization that the US is leading with this war as a pretext. So that is all the bad news, and I want to conclude on something hopeful and something important, which is that while this is a moment of militarization, it is also an opportunity to talk about demilitarization, to reassert the need to, again, evaluate 20 years of war. I think that in Washington, Aly spoke to what Washington has to gain from this war. I think that's extremely important, especially considering the fact that the Biden administration doesn't have any positive things to point to in terms of foreign policy before this war. Remember when Biden came into office, he said, America's back, and it's back at the head of the table of the world. And then it promptly had a disaster in Afghanistan. Not exactly inspiring in terms of the US position as the leader of the free world. Well, now, once again, the US can step in and say that it is leading the free world. We need to make sure that what happened in Afghanistan is not forgotten. We need to have the conversation that they avoided last year and talk about not only the disastrous withdrawal. Of course, the withdrawal had to happen, but the way the US withdrew made it evident that they didn't think for a minute about how it would impact Afghan people, which is in line with the whole war. They didn't think about Afghan people throughout the 2 decades of occupation and the previous decades, by the way. We need to have that conversation. We need to assert that kind of thing. We cannot allow them to have this new kind of mantle of legitimacy. And on the contrary, we need to demand an entirely different conversation. Thank you. And I'll just add, I won't elaborate, but Aly already made the point about the question of refugees too. This is revealing, unfortunately, the racist stratification with which refugees around the world are being treated. And in fact, this is an opportunity to demand a transformation of the way that not only this country treats refugees, but the whole way that refugees are treated in this world. And lastly, regarding climate change, renewable energy as well. I mean, it's remarkable that in light of a conversation around Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels, that instead of the answer being decarbonization, which if there was ever a moment to decarbonize, and if there was ever a place to decarbonize, it would be Europe right now. Instead, there is a conversation, again, being led by the United States about getting Europe dependent on other fossil fuels. There's a renewed notion that coal can be supply Europe's energy, that the United States can step in and provide natural gas and oil, and so on. We need to take this opportunity to demand the very opposite. So I will end there. I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm excited for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khury. Much appreciation for the big thinking on it and some of the things that we should be thinking about and doing. And with that in mind, we will now welcome our last speaker, Brian Escobar, who is the co-chair of the Syracuse chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, who will offer some concluding action items. So Brian, you're on.
Thank you. So, when we think about what actions that we're going to take, we have to, I'm going to make one assumption about folks here, and that is that you live in the United States, probably. And so as residents of the United States, we can best influence the US government, probably better than we can influence other governments. And so we can think through what is the US role. So there's a number of actions that we've collected and gathered, and some of them have been stated already in the presentations. And one of the things that we can do, one of the first things we can do, is to call our members of Congress and leave a message with our senators, Gillibrand and Schumer, as well as our Congressman Katko. And we have a document that we're going to share with you that has some talking points that you can use, and you can choose a couple of these. You could divide it up with families. One person does a few, one person does another few, because it is a few different things, because we want to make sure that there are concrete things that we can explore to avoid war, to end the war, and avoid further escalation. So I'm just going to go over a few of the points that we can be communicating to legislators. One is that we must ask them, we must say that we support the policy of not intervening militarily in the war in Ukraine, because there have been calls within the US for the US to militarily intervene, and including calls for a no-fly zone. But a no-fly zone is really a euphemism that it would, because no-fly zone, enforcing it does require direct military attacks on Russian forces by NATO. And that would risk escalating to nuclear war, which we definitely do not want. Another is calling for real substantial negotiations to end Russia's invasion. And we have to give those negotiations the best possible chance of success. It's not enough just to be willing to come to a table, but the US has to be willing to make compromises, and then Russia has to be willing to make compromises. You don't get diplomacy when it's a one-sided deal, when only one side gets what it wants. And so the US needs to be willing to say things that it hasn't been willing to say yet, which such as to give the negotiations the best chance of success. NATO and the US must be willing to recognize Ukraine as a neutral country if Russia was to end the invasion. Things like that. Things like offering to stop eastward expansion of NATO in exchange for ending the war. And then we also need to move beyond Cold War frameworks and Cold War alliances. And so we need to call for an international security arrangement in Europe that's not based on those Cold War alliances, that involves all the countries in Europe, including Ukraine and Russia, to be partner to it and have a say in it, to ensure peace and freedom from occupation in the region. And that could include revitalizing an organization called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There have been forums that have been pursued for this purpose. And those can be revitalized, so we can express support for that. And once again, nuclear war must be avoided. And so a bigger, longer term demand that Don mentioned was that we must express support for the Back the Brink campaign, which includes things like joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that the US is not a party to. It's been signed by 84 countries. And it also requires passing legislation. There's been legislation introduced by Representative Adam Smith and Senator Elizabeth Warren in 2020, an act to renounce first use of nuclear weapons, which the US has not done. It's current US policy doctrine to have first strike, to use nuclear weapons first in war. It's also Russian military doctrine to use nuclear weapons first in a war. And then we also must pass legislation. This will be in what we give out, that will end the sole unchecked authority of any US president or any other individual to launch a nuclear attack. And then we must also take the US nuclear arsenal off hair trigger alert. We've had near accidents in the past, and only through luck have they avoided nuclear strikes. And that's because the weapons are on a hair trigger alert. You know, weapons that are literally hundreds of times bigger than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and pointed at all of us, correctly. And then we must also cancel the $1.7 trillion plan to upgrade the nuclear arsenal and reallocate that money to programs that benefit the general welfare. And there's a couple other things. We must also ask Congress to resist pressure to increase spending on weapons and shift that money to rebuilding the State Department, which, does some, also does some spying and other things, but they are very crucial for diplomacy to work, having experts and, the Trump administration really reduced the funding of that. And then we must also urge members of Congress to uphold Title 42 cancellation and welcome asylum seekers. We must, the Biden administration has been continuing Trump policies around the border, and we must ask our legislators to vote no on any Republican amendment that would block access to asylum at the border. If we are going to be consistent about how we treat refugees, especially, and move towards changing the way we treat refugees in general. And then furthermore, those are all external, outward, kind of demands, things that we wish to express to our legislators in Washington. There's also things locally. All movements must be supported by organizing, and we must grow organizations at every step of the way. Every issue that comes up, every flashpoint, in every protest and event that's in the news. If we are continuing to build organizations, then we will grow our ability to act on these principles that we talked about. So for one, I would ask you to join the Nuclear Free World Committee of the Syracuse Peace Council in promoting the planning of the anniversary commemoration of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so more people understand the horrors of nuclear war. And we'll have information on how to do that. We'll also ask you to attend and help and promote educational programs of the Beyond War and Militarism Committee of the Peace Council, including their upcoming program on militarism and environmental destruction. We'll have information on that will go out to everyone. And as well as to visit peacecouncil.net to donate and find information about humanitarian efforts for Ukraine, subscribe to the SPC's e-newsletter and get involved. And then as well, you may become a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, there we'll have the link. There's a national organization working on local, state, and national issues. That's active here in Syracuse. And you can also make donations there, and we'll have all that information. But the one other thing I'll just mention is that if you are interested in tenants' rights, this Peace Council is having an upcoming event this Thursday with a lot of local organizations. And it's going to be a big town hall with Pamela Hunter. Because I do think it's very important to link national and local, and not allow politicians to kind of divide us between thinking about international things and local things. That's a big way they can kind of evade and kind of play around us. Anyway, that's all for me.
Thanks so much, Brian, for that very thorough list of things to do. And meanwhile, in the chat are several links. There's a link to a document that has all the points of what you can look at and when you're considering calling your representatives, as well as or contacting your representatives. There should also be contact information for being involved with the Nuclear Free World Committee and Beyond War and Militarism Committee, and working on organizing, because we can do so much more when we enhance each other's work by doing it together. And also information about DSA as well as the upcoming town hall event. And that is all in the chat, and we'll also send it out later to everybody who participated in the call, so you can have that, along with a link to the recording of this event. So thank you again, Brian, for that really great send-off after all of this, because there's always, you learn, but you need to do acting is what we've got to do too, as well as continuing to learn. So now we'll have question and answer. We don't have that long for it, about 15 minutes, but we'll be able to get a few in. If you have a question for a particular person, please address it to them. Otherwise, any of the panelists will take it. We ask that your comments and questions be under 1 minute so as to have a number of people who are able to ask. Brian is timekeeping that. We'll take questions from the chat, from the Facebook live stream, and raised hand virtually and on screen. It's a little easier for me if you do a virtual raised hand, because it's easier to see that as opposed to searching around for somebody scratching or is it a raised hand. So take a moment to put things into the chat, which will be monitored, and also think about if there's any questions you have. And we'll start with a raised hand, either virtually or not. Any questions or comments? Can't tell. Is that Ron? Ron Ehrenreich? You're on. Unmute yourself.
Yep. I just wanted to say that I feel strongly that in any negotiations for peace in the Ukraine, that Putin not get half a loaf, okay? That we not give any concessions to him for this incredible war that he's waged, and this inhumane, just, crimes against humanity war. And I wouldn't give him any concession in a negotiation.
Thanks, Ron. Do any of the panelists have anything you'd like to say about that? Nope.
I'll
Aly?
chime in a little bit. I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
How about Aly first and then you, Don, because I
Yeah,
saw.
go ahead.
No, I don't want to add too much. I just want to say, obviously I agree. I think we do not want to reward Putin in any way for this. There should be consequences for this. That being said, the calculus of war is incredibly harsh and brutal. And I think we should push for him not getting any concessions, but that might have to be something that we should consider as a peace community in terms of what's happening, especially given that he's going in a maximalist direction in terms of what he wants, So I just want to agree strongly with Ron that that's what we want. I just think we need to be realistic about what peace negotiations might look like in the end.
Thanks. And Don?
Yeah, I agree. If we can, if we can somehow find an exit strategy for him, I think that would be best. But no, I don't want to give him concessions.
Okay, thanks. Anything in the chat?
I just sent you one question from the chat. Carol, do you see it?
Could you please just ask the question?
Sure. This question is to Khury. I understand that your organization just did a webinar on diplomacy. What are some things that we could be promoting or that you think would be helpful?
Yeah, well, so the question of, okay, the question of Ukrainian territory, you know, and what happens to Ukraine's territory. I mean, we can have, and, you know, do you have thoughts and opinions on that? Of course, that's a conversation, that's a negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, right? Like, it's actually not the US's place, but what is in the US's power is the large number of US troops in Europe, the presence of US nuclear weapons in Europe, and the expansion of NATO, all of which actually are things that we should oppose anyway, and they happen to be things that Vladimir Putin has cited cynically, in my opinion, but has referred to as a pretext for the invasion. And so, you know, I think when it comes to, I mean, it's true. This question is true. Like, in a negotiation, there are concessions, and the U.S. should have done this anyway, but should be demilitarizing actually its presence in Europe. And I think that's something that we in the peace movement can demand.
Thanks. Anybody else want to say anything on that? So let's take another raised hand, which is Brent Flyer.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Carol, and thanks for bringing together folks tonight to hear about this and learn about this. My thought regarding the last question was that the people of Ukraine, obviously, I would think need to have a big say in this, and maybe any agreement would be put before them on a public site. I don't know how they're going to handle that aspect of it. But it seems the people of Ukraine are the ones who are going to be living with Russia as their neighbor and living with, tragically, with the consequences of all the destruction that's taken place. And I think we need to bear that in mind, that in the long run, that Ukraine, assuming they remain nation states, Ukrainians and the Russians need to somehow make peace with one another, and they're big trading partners. So anything that we want is demilitarization and US troops and weapons. I think that we can pressure our government on is our biggest chore. But I think if Ukrainians think it's in their interest to cede some territory with some status to Russia, to appease Russia, and tamp down the flames of aggression, I mean, I think that's more up to them, since it's their border and their nation and their neighbor. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks. And any of the speakers want to say anything about what Brent said?
I agree that it is Ukrainians are they're the victims, and they should have the say as to what goes on and not be geopolitical pawns.
Mariana, anybody from Facebook Live? Any comments there?
I don't see any.
Okay. Anything that you're seeing in the chat, Wendy? Is she saying something?
Sorry about that. I'll ask another question since I don't see any. Some people are saying that, you know, sanctions can be used, might be able to be used as off-ramps, and that there's a need to pay attention to that because, you know, a lot of people want to punish Russia, which is understandable, but as Khury pointed out, they also hurt ordinary people. So do people see that as a way to provide some incentive to stop what's happening?
So maybe Khury, you could address that since you had mentioned sanctions.
Sure, it's a good question, and I think that those of us who are anti-war folks, you know, who've been critical of U.S. violence, I think we collectively have actually struggled with this question. It's been really complicated, or it's felt complicated, but I think the answer is no. And one reason why is, you know, the U.S. already imposed sanctions on Russia, actually. You know, I believe going back to its invasion of Georgia in 2008. So, you know, there's been, the U.S. has had sanctions on Russia. They didn't prevent this invasion, and the sanctions that they have used are quite, I believe they're quite unprecedented. Like removing a country's banking system from the SWIFT international banking system is, like, you know, it's something that had been kind of discussed theoretically, but this it's a new level, and now it's like the U.S. has used this to develop a new weapon. So I don't think it's de-escalating things. I think that it's part of the overall escalation.
So maybe I should rephrase it. What I was asking is if in the negotiations, if steps toward lifting the sanctions could be helpful.
Yeah, that's yeah, I appreciate the clarification. I mean, maybe, I'm not sure. I mean, truthfully, because, you know, Putin has actually, like, there's some interesting reporting actually in the US media about things that Russia has done to make itself sort of sanctions proof. I mean, what it's done is made Putin and the richest people in Russia and, you know, Russian capital sanctions proof. So, you know, I'm not sure how much of a factor it is in terms of Putin's calculation. I think that we should demand an end to sanctions regardless, which again is not at the moment a popular demand, but I think that we have to find a way to make it.
And Aly, you wanted to respond to?
Yeah, the clarification actually helps, because I actually think it's not just that sanctions are an effective strategy. I think that sanctions oftentimes do the opposite of what we wanted to do. My anti-war journey started out opposing the sanctions in Iraq imposed by then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who just passed, given the humanitarian crisis that it created in this country. But what I remember at that particular moment was that Saddam Hussein used US sanctions as a tool of propaganda against the US. So in his own population, I mean, sanctions were like a gift to him. You know, he was able to point to the US and say, like, these are the people who are starving you. So I actually think that sanctions can be used as a way by these authoritarians to strengthen their power. It's one of the many reasons I just don't think they're a really useful strategy, especially given that we've seen that these kind of sanctions that are being imposed on Russians are just draconian. You know, before the media blackout on all things Russia, I was checking out some YouTube and social media accounts of just ordinary Russians, you know, who were basically saying, listen, you know, even though it's a risk, I'm here to say, like, you know, I think that Putin is a terrible person. I don't support this. And here are the ways these sanctions are affecting me now and are going to affect me in the future. And I thought that having access to those voices was really powerful, to hear from Russian citizens who were themselves saying, like, listen, we don't want anything to do with this war, and this is going to harm us. So I've just always felt like sanctions are a terrible, terrible tool.
So there is a question here that may have been partially answered, but I'll say it so that maybe people will be able to add to it. And that is, how can there be negotiations if nothing will be allowed to the Russian side?
Does this mean none of the panelists have any?
Well, we're talking about sanctions, and I mean, presumably the sanctions that are existing, which are quite draconian, as Khury pointed out, would be lifted. I mean, there has to be some return. The whole goal of negotiations is some return of normalcy and achieving peace. That's the whole goal, right? We have to get the Russians out of the Ukraine and achieve get Ukraine back, give the Ukrainians their country back. And of course, I would think that the sanctions would be lifted. And I want to just add that if you really, and Khury had mentioned this, I want to reiterate it. This is a wonderful time to really push to get Europe off of fossil fuels and permanently end its dependence on the oil and gas coming out of Russia.
Okay,
And of course, it's not an immediate thing. That's the problem. It takes time to make that structural change in the economy. But in my mind, that is the best ticket out of this mess.
So Diana, who had posed the question, do you feel your question was addressed? And you're on mute. If you're speaking, you're on mute.
Well, whoops, sorry. It's just very hard for me to believe that anybody thinks that Russia will ever return Crimea or Eastern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any last question? This would be the last one. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. If you do have a hand raised and I'm not seeing you, oops, I see one now. This is the last one. Oh no, this is Brent. I think he was already had his. Well, in that case, I want to thank everybody. We're just at the stroke of 8:30. So thank you so much to our presenters, Aly, Don, and Khury, and Brian, and the organizers of this event, which were Brian Escobar, Julia Ganson, Mariana Pernia, and Wendy Yost. Thanking also the hosts, the Peace Council and DSA, Syracuse DSA, and all the co-sponsors, and everyone here for coming. Thank you so much for coming, and keep organizing, learning, and acting. So thank you so much.
And how do we donate, Carol? How do we donate?
Go to peacecouncil.net. That should be in the document that was shared in the chat. And again, we will be sending all those links out to everybody too in the next few days. So
Great.
Thank you so much for being here, and we're going to just keep on working together. Thank you.
Keep on moving forward.